They handed her 2 suitcases and a check meant as an insult, and then they locked the door of the only home she had ever known. From the inside, by nightfall, a young woman stood alone on a cold and empty street, with everything she owned in 2 hands, and nowhere left in all the world to set it down. The people who should have held her closest had thrown her away, so she bought the one thing no one else would touch: a ruined house at the dead end of a forgotten lane, boarded windows, a sagging porch, a place the whole town crossed the street to avoid. And on her very first night inside those walls, something began to move, above her head, slow, heavy, dragging itself across a floor that was supposed to be empty. Scrape, thud, and whatever it was had been waiting in the dark a very long time. At the end of Hawthorne Lane, there stood a house the whole town had learned to walk past, not around, past. On the far side of the street, where the pavement was cracked but the air, at least, felt ordinary, mothers steered their strollers a little faster along that stretch. Old men out for an evening walk lowered their voices as they came near, the way people do beside a thing they cannot quite explain. The house waited at the dead end of the lane, where the road simply gave up and surrendered to a tangle of trees. Behind a curtain of thorned ivy it sat, its windows boarded like shut eyes, its shoulders hunched against the years. The paint had given up long ago. What might once have been a soft, buttery yellow had peeled down to a bruised and weathered gray, the color of something left too long out in the rain. Folks in Cole Harbor told stories about that house. They said a clockmaker had lived there, back before most of them were born. A quiet man. A man who kept to himself. A man some claim to have glimpsed at his high window at odd hours of the night, lit by a single lamp, and then, one autumn, glimpsed no more. They said he had walked out one evening and simply not come back. Some said the house had swallowed him. Some said worse. And the children, of course, dared one another to touch the front gate and run, shrieking, back into the safe and golden light of their own front porches. They were wrong about the house. All of them. The house was not swallowing anything. It was not hungry. And it was not cruel. It was, if such a thing can be said of wood and brick and old forgotten glass, patient. It was waiting. And the strange truth, the truth that not one soul on Hawthorne Lane could have guessed, was that the house had been waiting for one particular person, a young woman who did not yet know it existed, a young woman who, on that very same gray afternoon, was sitting in a stranger's cold office, learning in careful, terrible words just how little her own family believed she was worth. Her name was Nora Hale. She was 26 years old, and in the span of a single hour, she was about to lose every last thing she had ever called home. There are some women who spend the whole of their lives building something for other people. Nora had been one of those women, while other girls her age had been out chasing summers, chasing romance, chasing the bright and careless things that the young are supposed to chase. She had been at her father's side, learning the work, reading the long columns of figures by lamplight until her eyes ached, sitting quietly at the back of rooms full of men twice her age, men who looked at her and saw a girl, men who underestimated her again and again, and whom she quietly, patiently proved wrong. Her father had built a great deal from very little, a handshake in the right place, A risk taken when others hesitated. A name that came in time to mean something in the sort of town where a name could still open a door. And through all of it, Nora had been beside him. She knew the way he liked his coffee, dark and bitter, in the same chipped mug he refused to throw away. She knew the sound of his footsteps in the upstairs hall before the door ever opened. She knew which troubles kept him awake at night, and which small victories brought out that quiet, private smile she had loved since she was a little girl in pigtails, perched on the edge of his big desk. He used to rest a heavy hand on her shoulder and tell her the same thing, year after year. One day, all of this is yours. And she had believed him. Why should she not have? She had earned it, not with charm, not with luck, but with the long, unglamorous, unthanked labor of a woman who rises before the sun and does the work that needs doing, whether anyone is watching or not. And then, in one ordinary, unremarkable week, he was gone. It happened the way these things sometimes happen, without warning, without a proper goodbye, without the long, slow leave-taking that might have let her say the things a daughter saves up to say. One evening he was there, grumbling about the cold and the price of firewood. By the next, the house was full of strangers in dark clothes, speaking in hushed voices, leaving covered dishes on the kitchen counter that no one would ever eat. Nora moved through those gray days like a woman walking underwater. She did not weep where others could see her. That had been schooled out of her early, somewhere along the way. She simply did what needed to be done, because that was who she had always been. And somewhere beneath the cold, numb surface of her grief, she held fast to one small, steadying thought. At least she still had a home. At least there was still one place on this earth where she belonged. She was wrong about that too. The lawyer's office smelled of old paper and colder things. Nora sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back held straight, the way her father had taught her to sit when something of weight was about to be said. Across from her, in the good chair by the window, sat the woman her father had married, years after Nora's own mother had passed. Vivian, a handsome woman in the particular way that money makes a person handsome, pressed, polished, perfectly composed. She dabbed now and then at the corners of her eyes with a square of pale silk, though a careful observer might have noticed that those eyes stayed altogether dry. Beside her lounged her son, Preston, a young man who, in all his comfortable years, had been asked to wait for very little. He sat with one ankle crossed over the opposite knee, glancing now and then at the watch on his wrist, wearing the faint, restless look of a man counting down the minutes until he might be somewhere more amusing. The lawyer cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses. He looked down at the thick sheaf of papers before him, and then, for just a moment, he lifted his eyes to Nora, with something in them that looked very much like pity. That was the first sign. When a man like that looks at you with pity, before he has read a single word aloud, something, somewhere, has already gone wrong. He began to read. The words came slowly, carefully, the way that bad news has of arriving, as though, if it moves slowly enough, it might somehow hurt less. To my daughter Nora, he read, the sum of $15,000. She waited for the rest of it. There would be more. There was always more. The business they had built together, the house she had grown up in, the plans the two of them had drafted and redrafted at the kitchen table over 100 cups of cooling coffee. But the lawyer's voice moved on. The remainder of the estate, he read, the business, the holdings, the family home itself, to be left in full and without condition to his wife, Vivian. And then the room went very, very still. It was the kind of silence that has a weight to it, the kind that settles on a person's chest and makes the very air feel thin and hard to draw. $15,000 out of everything they had built, out of all those years. It was less than what Vivian might spend on a single weekend away. It was not an inheritance at all. It was a dismissal written out in numbers, a way of saying, without ever quite saying it to her face, the thing no one in that family had found the courage to speak aloud. You do not belong here. You were never truly one of us. When Nora finally found her voice, it was barely more than a whisper. There's been a mistake. She leaned forward in her chair. We made a plan, the two of us. We spent 3 years on it. He drafted every line of it with me, at our own table. He gave me his word. Vivian lowered the square of silk from her dry eyes, and there, at the corner of her painted mouth, appeared the faintest curve, not quite a smile. Something far colder than a smile. People change their minds, dear, she said, her voice soft as cream. Your father came to understand, near the end, that you simply weren't built to carry a thing this large. He wanted you to find your own small path in the world, without leaning on his name to do it. The words were gentle. That was the cruelty of them. The lawyer would not meet Nora's eyes. He said only, very quietly, that the new papers had been drawn up and properly witnessed, that it was done, that it could not be unmade. And Preston, rising at last, buttoning his fine jacket, looked down at her the way a man looks at a stain spreading across an expensive rug. Oh, he said, almost as though it had only just occurred to him. Mother's having the house photographed tomorrow morning. So if you wouldn't mind being out by this evening, that really would be best. He smiled at her. Your sort of mood doesn't quite suit the rooms. By the time the sun slid down behind the hills, Nora Hale stood upon the front steps of the only home she had ever known. 2 suitcases at her feet, a single folded check in the pocket of her coat. Behind her, the heavy door swung shut. She heard the bolt turn over, and then, just so there could be no mistaking it, she heard a second sound, the dull electronic chirp of the security code being changed, from the inside, by people who could not even trouble themselves to wait until she had reached the bottom of the drive. She stood there a moment longer than she ought to have, looking up at the windows, at the warm, buttery light glowing softly behind the curtains of a house that had decided it no longer wanted her in it. There is a particular kind of cold that has nothing whatever to do with the weather. Nora felt that cold then. It moved through her slowly, from somewhere deep in the chest, out to the very tips of her fingers. She bent. She took up her suitcases, one in each hand. She walked down the long gravel drive, past the gardens where she had played as a small child, out through the iron gate that had stood open to her for her whole life, and she did not turn to look back. A woman can carry a great deal when she has no other choice. Grief, shock, the whole of a life folded down small enough to fit into 2 suitcases. What a woman cannot carry, for very long, is the feeling of having no place left on this wide earth where she might simply set it all down. For 3 nights, she stayed in a small roadside motel a few towns over, the kind of place where the air smelled of old smoke and cheap cleaning spray, where the heater rattled in its corner like something trying to get free, where the light above the cracked mirror flickered if a person looked at it too long. She lay atop the thin bedspread, still wrapped in her coat, staring up at a brown water stain that bloomed across the ceiling. And in the long hours when sleep would not come for her, she did the quiet arithmetic of the ruined $15,000. It sounded like a fortune to anyone who had never needed to count. But Nora had counted her whole life, and she understood, to the dollar, just how quickly it would melt away in her hands. A deposit here. First month, last month. Somewhere else. A few short seasons of rent in any decent town. And then the check spent, the cushion gone, and a young woman left with no home and no family, beginning again from a place lower than nothing at all. She turned the problem over and over in the dark, the way her father had taught her to turn over a problem until it showed its weakness. And somewhere in the smallest hours of that third long night, something inside her went hard, not into bitterness, into resolve. She would not pour the last of what she had into another person's open hand, paying rent on 4 walls that could be taken back the moment some landlord changed his mind. She had spent enough of her years building things that other people then locked her out of. No. What she needed was something of her own. A roof, a door, a key that fit her hand and the hand of no one else. A place that no Vivian, no Preston, no carefully worded page could ever pry loose from her grip. She needed walls that were hers, even if they were cracked, even if they leaned, even if they were, by every sensible measure a sensible person might apply. A perfectly terrible idea. And it was that thought, strange and stubborn and just a little desperate, that carried her the very next morning to a place she would have laughed to imagine herself entering only a week before. The county auction was held in a plain municipal room under bad lighting and beside worse coffee. Rows of folding metal chairs, a projector screen glowing at the front, a scattering of men in fleece vests flipping through thick catalogs. The sort of men who buy ruined houses by the dozen, strip them down to the bones, and sell them off again without ever once learning the names of the streets they sit on. Nora took a seat in the back row, her coat buttoned to her chin, a numbered paddle resting across her knee. She watched as property after property rose up onto the screen. She watched the men in the fleece vests scoop them up, one after another, with the bored and easy efficiency of people for whom all of this was simply another ordinary Tuesday. Her small fortune would not stretch to reach a single one of them, and her hope, already worn thin as paper, began to wear thinner still. And then the screen changed. A new image flickered into place, grainy, gray. A photograph of a tall, narrow house with a sagging porch and boarded windows, half strangled in ivy, standing alone at the end of a quiet, forgotten lane. The auctioneer's voice took on a faintly weary note. The note a person's voice takes on when they already know exactly how a thing is going to go. "A late Victorian," he said. "Empty a long while now. Heavy damage, inside and out. Sold as it stands. Sight unseen." He paused. "Last owner was a clockmaker, by the records. A solitary sort. place has sat shut up ever since he went. We'll open the bidding low." A low murmur passed through the room. It was not a murmur of interest. It was that small, knowing sound men make near a thing that promises more trouble than it could ever be worth. The fleece vests did not so much as glance up from their pages. One of them gave a quiet chuckle and leaned to mutter something to the man beside him. Something about money pits and rotten bones and fools. The figure the auctioneer named was almost shamefully small, and still, not one hand moved. The silence stretched out long. Nora sat very still in the back row, her heart beating in a way she did not entirely understand. She looked at that gray, lonely house up on the screen, that ruined, unwanted thing at the end of its abandoned lane. And something in it spoke, quietly, to something in her. Here was a house the whole world had agreed was worthless. A house that had been written off and boarded up and turned away from, left to rot in the weather, simply because no one had ever troubled themselves to look at what might still be standing underneath all that ruin. She knew that feeling. She had been standing inside it for 3 days. Slowly. She raised her paddle. The auctioneer blinked as though mildly surprised to find a bidder at all. His eyes found her there at the back of the room. "The young lady. Do I hear a second?" He waited. The fleece vests turned a page, sipped their coffee, said nothing at all. "Going once," the auctioneer said. "Going twice." A breath. "Sold to the young lady in the back." And just like that, with the small dry crack of a wooden gavel, Nora Hale became the owner of a condemned house she had never laid eyes upon, on a street she had never walked, in a town she scarcely knew. When the fees were settled and the last paper signed, a little over $2,000 remained to her name, and into her open hand the county clerk placed 2 things: a thin folder of deeds, and a single heavy key of tarnished brass, gone dark with age, bundled in with the old papers of the house as though the two had never once been parted. A key far older and far stranger than any ordinary key had any right to be. It lay cold against her palm. Cold. And somehow, faintly, as though it had been waiting a very long while to be held by a living hand again. Storm clouds were gathering low and heavy over Cole Harbor by the time her small rented car turned at last onto Hawthorne Lane. The street took her by surprise. It was lovely, in fact, lined with tidy, well-kept homes, trimmed hedges and bright porch lights, and the soft orange glow of ordinary lives being quietly lived behind warm and curtained windows. And then the road began to narrow. The houses grew older. The hedges grew wild and unkempt. And there, at the very end, where the lane simply stopped and gave itself over to the trees, there it stood, number 9. Larger than its photograph had let on, and lonelier, too. It rose up out of the overgrowth like something half-remembered from an uneasy dream. 3 full stories of weathered gray, its porch sagging on one side like a tired and aching shoulder, its roof scattered with the dark gaps of missing shingles, its windows blind and patient behind their boards. The ivy had taken the chimney entirely. Nora cut the engine, and for a long while she simply sat there in the sudden and complete quiet, her 2 hands resting on the wheel, the enormity of what she had done settling down over her like the gathering dusk. This was hers now. This silent, ruined thing was the single place in all the world that belonged to her. She drew in a slow breath. She gathered up her flashlight and that strange brass key, and she stepped out into the rising wind. The wooden steps groaned beneath her boots, each one a long and low complaint, as though the house itself had not yet made up its mind whether it wished to let her in. She slid the heavy key into the rusted lock. It did not wish to turn. She had to lean her whole weight into it, shoulder pressed flat against the old oak door, until at last, with a sharp and sudden crack that rang out down the empty lane, the lock gave way. The door swung inward, and the smell came drifting out to meet her. Damp earth, old wood, dust that had lain undisturbed for a long, long time. And underneath all of it, faint and strange, something else she could not quite put a name to. A trace of dried flowers, perhaps, and beneath even that, something cooler still. Something almost metallic, sitting at the very back of the air. Nora clicked on her flashlight. The beam swept slowly across a grand and ruined entrance hall. Even in its decay, the house whispered of the wealth it had held in some better age. A great staircase curved upward into the darkness, its banister carved over with twisting vines and small, strange faces that seemed to watch her pass from within the shadows. Furniture stood draped in pale sheets, gathered here and there like quiet figures keeping some long and patient vigil in the gloom. It was beautiful, it was terrible, and it was, every cracked and crooked inch of it, her own. She spent those first hours doing the thing that frightened people do. She kept herself busy. She swept clean a corner of the kitchen. She cleared out a small room at the back of the ground floor and unrolled a thin camping mattress across the bare boards. She told herself, in the firm and reasonable voice she had once used in rooms full of doubting men, that there was nothing here at all but old wood and bad plumbing, and a great deal of honest work waiting to be done. She wedged a sturdy hardware store padlock through the front door. She lay down on the thin mattress in the dark, and she shut her eyes. And for the first time in many days, began to feel the smallest, most fragile thread of something that might one day grow into safety. It did not last the night. It was somewhere in the deep and silent middle of the night when the cold woke her. Not an ordinary cold. The kind that comes on all at once. The air in that small back room dropping so sharply, so suddenly, that her breath rose up in a pale, faint cloud above her face. She lay very still. The house was dark around her. The storm had passed on, and the quiet outside was complete now. The heavy hush of a whole town gone down into sleep. And then she heard it. Above her, on the floor above her head. There, where no one was, where there should have been nothing at all but empty rooms and rotting boards and dust, there came a sound. A slow, deliberate, dragging sound. Scrape. Then a pause. A long, waiting, breathing pause. Then a heavy, settling thud. Nora's eyes came open in the dark. She did not move. She scarcely allowed herself to breathe. Her hand crept out across the floor and found the flashlight and closed around it. The way a person closes a hand around the one solid thing left in a world that has suddenly and quietly come loose at the seams. The sound came again. Scrape, thud, slow, patient, even. It was not the random creak and groan of an old house easing itself in the cold. She knew that difference well enough. This had a rhythm to it, a purpose. Something heavy was being drawn across the floor above her, lifted, dropped, and drawn again. over and over, at the same steady, unhurried, measured pace. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud, as though something up there in the dark were keeping time. She lay frozen on that thin mattress, gripping the cold flashlight to her chest, until the first gray light of morning began at last to bleed through the cracks in the boarded windows. And the sound at last fell still. But Nora Hale felt no relief in the stillness, because she lay there in the cold and breaking dawn, staring up at the ceiling, up toward that floor above where no living thing had any business walking. And she understood one thing now with a perfect, quiet, chilling certainty. She was not alone inside that house. And whatever it was that shared those walls with her had been waiting there in the patient dark, far, far longer than she had. Morning came slow and pale to Hawthorne Lane, and when the first thin light reached in through the cracks of the boarded windows, the young woman on the thin mattress had still not closed her eyes. She lay there a long while, listening. But the house was quiet now. Whatever had kept its slow and patient time all through the dark hours had gone still with the coming of the day, the way some things do when the light finds them. Nora rose at last, stiff, cold down to the bone. She folded the blanket with hands that would not quite stop shaking, more out of habit than need. Because a woman raised to keep order will reach for order even when the very floor has dropped out from under her life. She did not believe in ghosts. That was the thing she kept telling herself over and over as she splashed cold water on her face from the one tap in the house that still worked. She was a practical woman, a woman of figures and contracts and careful, sensible choices. And practical women did not lie awake in the dark, gripping a flashlight to their chest, listening to something heavy drag itself across a floor that held nothing at all. But she had heard it. Scrape, thud. She had heard it as plainly as she heard her own heart now, beating too quick beneath her ribs. And a practical woman, when she cannot explain a thing, does not flee from it. She finds out what it is. That was how her father had raised her, to walk toward the locked door and not away from it. And though that man had been laid in the ground only weeks before, his voice still lived somewhere inside her, steady and low, telling her what it had always told her. Look closer, Nora. The answer is in the thing nobody else troubles to examine. The little town of Cole Harbor was just stirring awake as she walked down into it. Shutters going up along the quiet street. The warm smell of coffee and fresh bread drifting out from a corner diner. A man sweeping the step of a hardware store who paused with his broom to watch her pass, with the open and unhurried curiosity of a place where a new face was a rare event indeed. She felt their eyes on her. She knew already what they were thinking. There goes the one who bought the house at the end of the lane. There goes the poor fool. She lifted her chin and walked on. She found what she was looking for tacked to a corkboard just inside the diner door. A simple paper flyer, curling a little at its edges, faded by the years. A name, a trade, a promise of honest work at a fair price. Caleb Ward. She did not know, as she stood there with a lukewarm cup of coffee going cold in her hand, that the name on that curling slip of paper would come to matter a great deal, to the house, and in ways she could not yet imagine. to her. She knew only that something was moving inside her walls, and she needed a man who understood old bones to tell her what it was. He came that very same morning, in a battered truck that had plainly weathered a great many winters. Caleb Ward was a man somewhere in his early 30s, broad through the shoulders, slow and easy in his movements, with a weathered, watchful look about him and a heavy tool belt slung low across one hip. He stepped down from the truck and stood a moment at the foot of the drive, gazing up at the gray and sagging house with a long, low whistle pushed out through his teeth. "So somebody finally went and bought the Crane place," he said. He said it the way a person says the name of a thing the whole town has quietly agreed to leave alone. "Folks around here keep their distance from this lot." He looked at her then, and there was no mockery in it, only a plain and honest surprise. "You're either a very brave woman, or you don't yet know what it is you've gotten yourself into." "Both, most likely," Nora said, and something that was nearly a smile touched one corner of the man's mouth. She liked that he had a sense of humor buried somewhere under all that quiet. It had been a long while since anything had made her want to smile back. She led him up the groaning steps and in through the heavy front door. She did not tell him, at first, about the sound. She told him only that she needed to know whether the upper floor was sound or whether it might come down upon her head while she slept. She told him she was on a tight budget, every dollar counted, and that she needed the plain truth from him, with no padding put on it to run up the bill. He liked that, she could see, the plainness of it. A man who works with his hands learns, in time, to mistrust people who never come straight to the point. He drew a small device from his belt, a little tool that threw a thin red point of light, and together they began to climb the great curving staircase up into the gloom of the second floor. The upper hall was a long and shadowed thing. Doors stood shut along its length, swollen tight in their warped frames. The air up here was heavier, older, and it carried that same strange trace she had caught the night before, and the night before that. Dried flowers, and beneath the flowers, cool and faint and curious, that thread of something almost like metal. Caleb moved slowly from room to room. He tapped his knuckles against the walls. He sighted down the length of the buckled floorboards with one eye closed. He murmured to himself the small, private language of a man who has spent his whole life learning what old houses are trying so hard to say. In the largest of the rooms, the ceiling sagged low and tired in its center, stained a deep brown where water had found its slow way in over the long years. He frowned up at it. He raised his little tool and threw its red point against the ceiling, then down the long throat of the hall. He paced the floor, counting his steps under his breath. He stopped, frowned harder, and paced them out a second time. And slowly, that frown deepened into something else, something that was not quite worry, something far closer to wonder. "Now that," he said quietly, "is strange." Nora's heart, which had only just begun to settle in her chest, climbed back up into her throat. "Is it going to fall?" she asked. "Is it the structure?" "No." He lowered the tool and turned to face her in the dim and dusty hall. "It's the math." He gestured up at the low ceiling above their heads. From out on the lane, this house stands 3 full stories tall. Anybody with 2 eyes can see it. He tapped the plaster with 2 fingers. "So there ought to be a good deal of room up over our heads right about now. An attic, a third floor, call it what you like. He paused. But these ceilings here? 9 feet, give or take. And the roof line starts a long, long way up above that. He let the words settle into the cold air between them. There's a whole floor up there, he said, above us, and there is no way into it. Nora stared at him. There has to be a way in, she said. A hatch, a pull-down stair, a door tucked in the back of a closet somewhere. I've looked. He shook his head slowly. Every closet, every ceiling on this floor, the whole length of this hall, twice over. His voice dropped lower, and there in the hush of that shadowed corridor, it carried a weight that lifted the fine hairs along her arms. Whoever finished the inside of this house sealed that third floor away, closed it up, smooth and clean as any wall you ever leaned against. He looked at her steadily. From in here, he said, it might as well not exist at all. And there, standing in that cold and silent hall, Nora felt the slow, dragging weight of the night before move once more through her memory. Scrape, thud. If the floor above was sealed, if there was no door and no stair, and no way for any living thing to climb up into that hidden dark, then what, in the long hours of the night, had been walking? They did not stop after that. There comes a moment in the middle of any true mystery when fear and curiosity quietly change places, when the question itself grows larger than the dread of its answer. Nora had passed through that moment somewhere in the cold gray of the dawn, and now she could no more have turned and walked away from it than she could have stopped the breath in her own chest. For the better part of the next 2 hours, the two of them took the second floor apart, board by board. They tapped along the walls, heads tilted, listening hard for that hollow change in the sound that tells a builder there is empty space waiting behind the plaster. They peeled back rotted carpet. They drew aside the pale, ghost-like sheets and shifted the heavy furniture beneath them, inch by stubborn inch, dust rising in soft clouds around their hands. And it was at the very end of the hall, in a dead and useless corner where the corridor simply gave out, that they found it. A great wardrobe of dark mahogany stood there, pressed flush against the wall. It had no business in that corner. It served no purpose there at all. And when Caleb set his broad shoulder against it and heaved, it would not budge, because it had been fastened to the wall behind it with heavy iron brackets, bolted deep, as though someone, long ago, had wished very much for it to stay precisely where it was. That, more than anything else, decided them both. A thing is hidden for a reason, and a thing hidden as carefully as this is a thing worth the trouble of finding. Caleb worked the old bolts loose, one slow turn at a time, and then the two of them leaned their weight into the great wardrobe together and walked it, groaning, screaming, out from the wall. Behind it, the plaster was older, paler, untouched by the long years, and cut into that plaster so cleverly, so seamlessly, that a person might pass it 100 times and never once see it, was a panel of smooth wood, door-shaped, door-sized, with no handle, no hinge that showed, only a small keyhole, rusted dark with age. Nora's hand went slowly to the pocket of her coat and drew out the heavy key of tarnished brass. Her fingers trembled as she fit it to the old lock. For a breath, it would not turn. The way the front door, too, had been unwilling to turn. And then, with a deep and heavy click that seemed to travel down through the very bones of the house, the lock surrendered. Caleb laid his palm flat against the wood and pushed. A rush of cold, stale air came pouring out around the edges of the panel. It carried that scent again, stronger now, unmistakable. Dried flowers, and riding underneath it, cool and singing, that strange bright thread of metal. The panel swung inward, into blackness, and there, caught in the hard white beam of Caleb's work light, was a narrow flight of wooden stairs, climbing steeply upward, vanishing into a darkness so deep and so complete that it seemed to drink the light right out of the air. "Stay behind me," Caleb said. It was perhaps the kindest thing a man could have offered, but Nora was already moving past him toward the first step, because whatever waited at the top of those stairs, it waited inside her house. And a woman who has had everything stripped away from her learns, in time, to walk straight toward the thing she fears the most, rather than stand below it, trembling, and wait for it to come down to her in the dark. The stairs cried out beneath their weight, each tread a long and aching note in the blackness. The dust of long forgotten years lifting in soft gray ghosts around their climbing boots. And then they reached the top, and Nora Hale stopped, and the cry that rose up in her throat caught there, and turned instead into a long and wondering breath that emptied her lungs entirely. Because the hidden third floor of that house was no dusty tomb of cobwebs and forgotten junk. It was a cathedral. Light came pouring down from high above, soft and silver and clean, falling through a great hidden skylight set into the very peak of the roof. A window no soul on the ground below could ever have dreamed was there. And that gentle falling light came to rest upon a thing so strange, so vast, and so impossibly beautiful that for a long moment neither of them could find a single word fit to lay upon it. The whole of the floor had been made into one great room, and the room itself had been made into a machine. From the heavy beams overhead there hung hundreds upon hundreds of brass gears, bright, golden, glowing warm in the falling light, linked one to the next by taut steel cables that hummed, faintly, with a quiet life all their own. They turned, slowly, steadily, without end, catching the silver light and throwing it back in soft, moving glimmers across the high walls. And there, in the very center of it all, stood a great cylinder of brass, tall as a small room, shaped like the secret inner workings of some giant grandfather clock, laid open and bare for the human eye to wonder at. Below it ran a track, sunk down into the floor, and along that track, drawn slowly by a thick and heavy chain, moved a great block of iron. As the gears turned high overhead, the block was dragged forward an inch and dropped with a low and settling weight down into a waiting notch, and then dragged forward once again. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud. Nora let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the very middle of the night. "It's a weight," she whispered. "A counterweight." She took one slow step toward the great moving track, her eyes wide, her terror draining out of her and leaving something vast and clean and quiet in its place. "The house was never haunted at all," she said softly. "The dragging, the footsteps. It was this." She lifted her gaze to the turning gears far above. "It has been this all along. The whole house was built around this machine, built to hold it, built to hide it from the world. Caleb walked slowly along the curved edge of the great brass cylinder, one hand trailing across its cold and gleaming surface. His weathered face lit up with the open, boyish astonishment of a craftsman standing before a thing that no craftsman of his own day could ever hope to build. "This wasn't put here to keep something out," he said quietly. "I've seen safe rooms. I've seen the vaults rich men build to sleep easy." He shook his head, slow and amazed. "This was built to keep something hidden, perfectly, patiently, for just as long as it ever needed to stay that way." And it was then that Nora saw the desks. Scattered around the wide edges of that great and humming room stood a number of old drafting tables. Their surfaces were covered over with faded papers and heavy, leather-bound books, the tools of a careful, secret trade laid down and left to wait. She crossed to the nearest of them, drawn as though by a thread tied somewhere deep in her chest, and her fingers came to rest on the cover of a great ledger, its corners bound in brass, its leather grown soft and dark with years of handling. A name had been pressed into that cover, in faded gold leaf: Silas Crane, the clockmaker. The solitary man the whole town had long ago agreed to forget. She opened the heavy book, and what lay inside was no diary, and no plain record of clocks mended and pocket watches cleaned. It was a register of work, page upon careful page of it, sketches of hidden compartments, drawings of clever doors that showed no seam to any searching eye. The patient, secret art of a man who had given his whole life to building places where other people might hide away the things they could not bear to lose. She turned the pages slowly, one after another, and the deeper she read, the stranger the truth before her grew. The lonely clockmaker had been no idle tinkerer puttering away at the end of a forgotten lane. He had been a maker of secrets, for people of great name and far greater fortune. People who had come quietly to his door precisely because he was the sort of man the wide world looked straight past. A man who kept to himself. A man who would carry their secrets down into the grave with him and breathe a word of them to no living soul. And then she came to one of the last pages in the book, and the breath went clean out of her. For there, set down in that same careful hand, dated not so very long ago at all, was a name she knew better than she knew her own. Her father's name, Thomas Hale. She read it 3 times over before she could make herself believe what her own eyes were showing her. "Caleb," she said, and her voice did not sound at all like her own. "Caleb, come and look at this." He came to her side and looked down at the open page. Below her father's name ran a short and orderly list. Modifications. Changes made to a certain house at the end of a certain quiet lane. The ceiling of a 3rd-floor stair. A panel of plaster, set flush and smooth. A lock at the machine's very heart that would yield to nothing in this world but the patient, turning rhythm of the great machine itself. Nora pressed one hand flat against the old desk to steady herself. "He knew this man," she breathed. "My father knew him. He didn't only know him. He came to him. He had him do all of this." She lifted her eyes to the great turning machine at the center of the room, and a thought began to rise up in her, slow, enormous, like the sun climbing at last over the edge of a long and frozen field. "He hid something here," she said. It sat upon one of the desks. Close beside the great brass cylinder, a heavy envelope of cream-colored paper sealed with a single drop of crimson wax. and laid where a searching hand would be certain, in its own good time, to find it. Her own name was written upon the front of it. In her father's hand, Nora's fingers shook so badly she could scarcely break the seal, and Caleb, seeing it, stepped quietly back, the way a decent man steps back from a thing that is not his to witness. He turned his eyes to the great machine and gave her the one small grace he had to give, the grace of distance. She unfolded the heavy page, and she began to read. My dearest Nora, if these words have found their way into your hands at last, then the thing I hoped for has come to pass, and your good and stubborn heart has carried you exactly to the place where I prayed, with all that was left of me, that it would. She had to stop. She pressed the back of one hand hard against her mouth, and then she made herself read on. I am sorry for the pain of that cold office, for the cruelty of those words. Read out over your bowed head. There is no apology in this world large enough for it, and so I will not waste these last pages trying to make one. I will only ask you to read on to the very end, and then, at last, to understand. The woman I married and the son she brought into our home are not the people they show to the world. Some while ago, I came to learn a hard truth. The two of them had fallen in deep with people of a very bad sort, people to whom heavy debts were owed, people who do not forgive a debt, people who would think nothing at all, of using my own daughter to settle one. They had already begun to drain away everything the two of us built, quietly, cleverly, a little at a time, in ways meant to slip past any watching eye. And in the moment, I understood that. I understood something else as well, that if I stood up and fought them out in the open, I would lose. And worse than losing, I would set you, my own child, directly in the path of people I had no power left to protect you from. So I did a far harder thing than fighting. I played the fool. I let her believe that she had won. I let her press the pen into my hand and stand over my shoulder while I signed away the empty shell of all our years of work. I gave her the house, the name, the papers she had grown so hungry for that she could taste them, and while she sat counting up her victory, I took everything of true worth, every real thing the two of us ever built together, and I moved it all to a place her hands could never reach, to the one corner of this world I knew, beyond all doubt, that she would walk straight past and laugh at and forget by morning. Here, I left you only just enough to buy back your own life with. I knew your practical heart, child. I knew you would not waste a single dollar of it on rent inside some other man's walls. I knew you would go looking for a roof that no one could ever take away from you again. I saw to it quietly that this house would come back into the world for almost nothing, cheap enough and ruined enough that the men who buy and gut and sell would not trouble themselves to raise a hand for it. And I knew as surely as I have ever known anything that you would find it. Everything I ever truly built belongs to you. It has only ever belonged to you from the very start. Take it back. Stand up straight the way I taught you to stand. And remember, whatever they made you feel in that cold and quiet room, you were the one who was worth all of it. And they were the ones who were worth nothing at all. With every last piece of my heart. Dad. For a long moment, The only sound in that great room was the slow and patient ticking of the machine. Scrape, thud, the steady, beating heart of her father's last and greatest secret. And then Nora Hale, who had not once let herself weep before another living soul through all the long gray days of her ruin. Let the tears come at last. They fell without a sound. They splashed down onto the heavy page in her trembling hands, onto her father's careful, loving writing, because the betrayal that had so very nearly broken her in half had been no betrayal at all. It had been love, the hardest, the most hidden, the most heartbreaking kind of love that a parent can ever give a child. A love that put on the mask of cruelty and let itself be hated and let itself be cursed, so that the child it was protecting might simply go on living. He had not thrown her away. He had been reaching for her all this time. From the far side of a locked and silent door, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she lowered it again, something in her face had changed. The grief was still there. It would be there a long while yet, but underneath it now, steady and warm and slowly rising, was something that had been missing from her for far too long. Hope. And beneath the hope, banked low and patient as the turning of those great brass gears overhead, the first quiet, glowing ember of resolve. It was the old woman from down the lane who set the last piece quietly into place. She came the following afternoon, drawn out of her own warm kitchen by the strange truck in the drive and the open front door of a house that had stood shut and silent for as long as she could rightly recall. A small, sharp-eyed woman with white hair pinned up neat as a pin and a covered tin of something warm held out before her in both hands, like an offering of peace. Marlene, she gave her name as. She had lived at the bend in the lane for a great many years, and when Nora, moved by a simple kindness she had very nearly forgotten still existed in the world, sat down with her on the sagging front steps. The old woman began to speak of the man who had built the house. Silas Crane, Marlene said softly, gazing up at the gray and weathered face of it. Oh, the town did that man a wrong, you know. The whole town did. Every last one of us. She shook her white head slowly. He was a strange one. I'll not stand here and pretend that he wasn't. Kept the oddest hours. Spoke to almost no one. And folks, you see, they fear the things they don't trouble themselves to understand. So they decided, all of them together, that there was something wrong with the quiet man at the end of the lane. Her voice dropped low. Stepped wide around his gate, they did, and pulled their coats a little closer. Hushed their little ones whenever his name came up. She turned her sharp old eyes upon Nora. But that man, she said, fixed my Joseph's pocket watch one hard winter, and would not take a single penny for the work. Shoveled my walk for me 3 mornings running when the snow came down heavy and my back was too poor to manage it. And he slipped off home each time before I could so much as get to the door to thank him. She smiled, a small and crooked thing, soft with memory. The kindest soul on this whole lane. And they wrote him off as something to be feared, for no greater crime than that he didn't fit the shape they had decided a man ought to fit. Nora sat very still beside her. They looked at his house, Marlene went on, gazing up at it, and they saw something worthless, something to be locked up tight and turned away from and left to fall down into the weeds. She reached over and patted the young woman's hand. "And all this time, my dear, all this long time, there was something extraordinary living inside it. They simply never once thought to look. And there, on the sagging front steps of the house the whole town had agreed to forget, the old woman's words settled down into Nora Hale like a key, turning soft and sure in a long-stuck lock. A house the world had called worthless. A man the world had thrown away. A daughter read out of a will in a cold and paneled room, and told in plain numbers that she did not belong. How quick the world was, she thought. How terribly quick to look at a thing and decide that it held nothing of value at all. And how often, how very, very often, it was wrong. She looked up at the great gray house, her house now, and for the first time since she had laid eyes upon it, she did not see ruin standing there before her. She saw what was waiting, patient and golden, inside. That night, she climbed the narrow stair once more, alone this time, a lantern swinging in one hand, and the steady, beating rhythm of the machine to keep her company in the dark. And she came to stand before the great brass cylinder at the heart of it all. The true vault, she understood now, and she searched with careful hands for the way inside. But there was no keyhole to be found, no handle, no dial, no lock of any kind that her searching fingers could discover. There was only a small chalkboard bolted to the wall beside the great steel door, and upon it, written in a chalk that had somehow outlasted all those long and silent years, a single line in the clockmaker's own careful hand: "The door yields only to the rhythm of time." Nora stood before it a long while, the lantern light flickering soft and gold across those faded words. Her father had built a whole fortune and hidden it away in the belly of a machine. He had left her the key to the house, and the house had led her to the stair, and the stair had led her, at the last, to this, to the very heart of all his secrets. And here, at the final door, he had set down one last test for her, a test that would not yield to force, a test that would open only to the one who truly understood the rhythm of the thing itself. She did not yet know, standing there in the soft and patient dark, how she would ever solve it. She knew only, with a certainty that started somewhere deep and would not be moved, that she would, because the man who had built all of this, gear by patient gear, had believed with his whole heart that she could. And it was time, Nora Hale thought, as the great machine beat on around her like a living thing, long past time, to prove that her father had been right about her all along. The days that followed belonged to the machine. Nora climbed the narrow stair each morning with the first gray light, and she did not come down again until the dark had settled thick and complete over Hawthorne Lane. She brought a stool up with her, a lamp, a flask of coffee that went bitter long before noon, and she sat before the great steel door at the heart of the brass cylinder, and she tried to understand. The chalkboard mocked her with its single line of faded writing: "The door yields only to the rhythm of time." She read those words so many times, in so many lights, that they began to lose their shape entirely, the way any word will when a person stares at it too long and too hard. Below the riddle, the clockmaker had left his quiet instructions. A weight hung from a slender chain, a plain bucket of dark iron, swaying gently in the still and dusty air, and a small wooden crate of brass measures beside it, each one stamped neat with its own number, each one waiting to be lifted and set inside. The idea of it was plain enough on its face. Set the right weight in the bucket. The great pendulum within would begin to swing at the right pace, and somewhere deep in the patient belly of the machine, a single pin would slip free, and a lock would turn, and the heavy door would open at long last. But set the wrong weight, and the machine would seize, and the door would close itself away forever. The chalkboard warned in that same careful hand, beyond the reach of any living soul to open again. One chance. That was what the clockmaker had built into the heart of his great machine. One chance, and no second. Caleb came up when he could spare the hours. He would climb the narrow stair with his tools and his quiet, weathered patience, and the two of them would bend together over the riddle in the soft and falling silver light. He was a clever man, a man whose broad hands knew the secret language of weights and balances better than most ever would. And he tried, in the steady way that men like him try, to break the thing down into honest numbers he could trust. He measured the length of the great swinging arm. He weighed the empty bucket in his palm. He filled the dust on an old desk with figures, crossing them out, beginning again, the chalk grinding low between his fingers. But the machine would not be reasoned with so simply. Each time he thought he had its measure, the math would shift beneath his hands like dry sand running through a fist. A figure here that refused to hold its place. A number there that would not settle no matter how he turned it. "It's close," he would murmur, wiping the chalk dust from his fingers onto his jeans. "It's close. But close won't do, Nora. Not with one chance and no takebacks." And Nora would watch the great pendulum sway, slow and patient in the gloom, catching the light along its brass. And she would feel the answer hanging there, just beyond the very edge of her reach, so near she could almost taste it, and so very, very far. It was on the fourth long evening that the thought finally came to her. She had not been working on the riddle at all in that moment. She had set the figures aside in weariness and let her tired eyes drift up to the great turning gears overhead, to that soft and endless glimmer of lamplight moving slow across the brass. And she let herself remember her father, not the loss of him. She had carried the loss for weeks now, heavy as a stone sewn into the lining of her coat. No. For the first time, she let herself simply remember the man, the way he took his coffee, dark and bitter, in the same chipped mug he would not let anyone throw away, the sound of his footsteps in the upstairs hall, and the thing he used to do, late into the night, on the evenings when some problem would not let him rest. He would sit at the kitchen table in the low and golden lamplight, and he would tap 2 fingers against the worn old wood, slow, steady, a rhythm all his own, the same patient rhythm year after year after year, as steady and as certain as a heartbeat in the dark. She had teased him for it once when she was a girl with skinned knees and too many questions. That little drumming of his, that quiet, private beat that went on and on beneath every late-night worry. And he would look up at her and give her that small and secret smile and say the very same thing he always said, that a man kept his own time in this world, that the world outside could rush and clamor all it liked, but a steady heart kept its own steady rhythm. And that, he told her, was how a person held fast through the hard and sleepless nights. By keeping their own time, when everything around them came undone. Nora sat very still upon her stool, the flask of cold and bitter coffee forgotten in her hands, the rhythm of time. She rose slowly to her feet, and she felt her heart begin to climb up into her throat. The clockmaker had not asked her to calculate a thing. He had not built this final door for some clever stranger with a sharp mind and a trusted set of figures. He had built it for one single person in all the world, for the daughter of the quiet man who had come to him in secret years before and asked him to hide a fortune in the belly of a clock. He had built a door that would open to a rhythm that one daughter and one daughter alone would carry inside her chest, her father's rhythm. The patient beat of 2 fingers on an old kitchen table in the low lamplight of 100 long-ago nights. "Caleb," she said softly, "put the figures away." He looked up at her from the cluttered desk, surprise plain on his weathered face. "The answer was never a number," she said, and her voice came out very quiet and very sure. "He didn't build this for someone clever to solve. He built it for me. He left it where only I would ever find it, and he locked it with something only I would ever know." She crossed the room to the swaying iron bucket, and she set her hand flat against its cold curve to still it. And then she closed her eyes, and she let herself hear it. The slow, steady tap of 2 fingers against a worn old table. The rhythm that had carried her father through 100 sleepless nights, through every worry and every quiet victory of his long life. She found it in her memory, soft and worn and familiar as her own name. And she began to tap it out, gently, against the cold iron of the bucket. Slow, steady, 2 beats, and a pause, 2 beats, and a pause. Her father's heart, beating on somewhere in the dark. Then she opened her eyes, and she began to set the weights, not by the numbers, not anymore, by the feeling. She gave the great pendulum a gentle push, and she watched it swing, and she listened with her whole body to the pace of it. And where it ran too quick for the rhythm in her chest, she added a little weight. And where it ran too slow, she lifted a little away, listening, adjusting, matching the long swing of that great brass arm to the patient beat she carried inside her. A small weight in, a smaller one out, until the great pendulum was swinging slow and even and true, in perfect time with the soft drumming of her father's fingers. Tick, and a pause. Tock, and a pause. The rhythm of time. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened at all. The room held still. The gears turned. The arms swung. And Nora stood with her heart in her throat, certain, suddenly, that she had been a fool. That she had ruined her one chance on a sentiment, a memory, a girl's foolish hope. And then, deep inside the great brass cylinder, something shifted. A profound and heavy turning, far down in the belly of the machine, that she felt rising up through the soles of her feet before her ears ever caught the sound of it. The endless ticking of the gears changed all at once, fell into something deeper, slower, larger. A great echoing heartbeat that swelled to fill the whole of that vast and silver room. And then a long, slow hiss of escaping air, and the steel door, heavy as a fallen oak, swung slowly open upon its hidden hinges and showed them the darkness waiting within. Nora let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 4 long days. She had not solved it with a sharp and clever mind. She had solved it with a daughter's heart. And somewhere, in some place she had no name for, she felt with a certainty that needed no proof, that her father was smiling that small and private smile of his, the one he had saved, all those years, for her. The inside of the vault was nothing at all like the cold steel that guarded it. It was warm, lined floor to ceiling with shelves of polished wood, gone soft and golden in the light of her raised lantern. It looked less like a safe than like a study, a quiet, private room where a careful and thoughtful man might sit and turn a problem over in the lamplight. And in the very center of it stood a single desk. Upon that desk sat 3 things: a heavy canvas bag slumped with its own weight, a small, sleek case of dark metal, the kind that holds a thing far more precious than its modest size would suggest, and a thick folder, tied shut with a length of plain brown string. Nora set the lantern down with hands that had begun, once more, to shake, and she reached for the folder first. What she found inside, page after careful page, told a story she had already half guessed, but had not let herself wholly believe until that very moment. It was the proof of everything her father's letter had quietly promised, records that showed, plain and undeniable, how the woman who had married him and the son she had brought into his home had been bleeding the work of his whole life dry, a little at a time, hidden away behind clever words and falsified accounts, money that had vanished into the dark, into the waiting hands of the bad sort of people her father had warned her of with his last written words. And there, laid alongside the proof of all they had taken, was the proof of all that was hers, papers that showed, beyond any argument that a sharp lawyer might dream up, that everything of true value her father had ever built had been quietly carried away, out of the empty, ruined shell he had handed his wife with such a convincing show of defeat, and into a single, hidden trust, a trust tied by his own clever and loving hand to the deed of one ruined house at the end of one forgotten lane, a house that belonged now to Nora, which meant that all of it belonged to Nora. The heavy canvas bag held what such a bag holds, when a careful man quietly prepares himself for war. And the small metal case held a record of every wrong the 2 of them had ever done, set down in a form that no court in the land could turn its eyes away from. Caleb stood in the open doorway of the vault, looking at the quiet inventory of it all, spread out before them in the soft lantern light. "You didn't just find a house," he said quietly. "You found every last thing you were ever owed." Nora stood there among her father's secrets, and she felt the long, cold weight of grief and ruin begin, at last, to lift away from her shoulders. "He didn't leave me with nothing," she said softly. "All this time, I believed he had, and he left me with this. He left me a way to stand back up." She looked at the proof spread out before her on the desk, the evidence of all they had done in the dark, the papers that, page by careful page, made her whole again. And for the first time since that cold and paneled office, Nora Hale stood up perfectly straight, the way that her father had taught her so long ago to stand. But the world, as the world has a way of doing, did not leave her long in peace. For a few short and golden days, There was something very close to happiness on Hawthorne Lane. Caleb came in the mornings, and the two of them began, slowly and gently, to coax the great old house back toward life. They cleared the fallen plaster. They let light into rooms that had stood dark for longer than anyone could rightly say. Marlene brought her covered tins and her sharp old wisdom, and she sat on the front steps in the thin afternoon sun, telling stories of the lane as it had been in better days. And Nora began, carefully, quietly, to plan. But happiness, when it comes to a person who has been hunted, has a thin and watchful quality to it. It sits lightly. It keeps one eye upon the door. And Nora had not allowed herself to forget her father's warning. People to whom heavy debts were owed. People who would think nothing of using her to settle one. The first sign was a small one. A car parked too long at the mouth of the lane. A car that belonged to no one in Cole Harbor, sitting quiet in the gray of the early morning, its windows dark and still. There a while. And then, when she looked again from the upper window, simply gone. The second sign was a great deal worse. It was Marlene who brought it, climbing the front steps with a worried set to her small, sharp face. There were men in town today, the old woman said, asking after you, and after this house. She lowered her voice, though there was no living soul near enough to hear. Not from around these parts. Hard sorts, my dear. The kind that smile when there's no good reason in the world to be smiling. And Nora felt the old cold come creeping back into her chest. The cold of the office. The cold of the locked front door. And the long night on the front steps with 2 suitcases at her feet. She understood then the thing her father had seen so clearly and so far ahead. The woman who had taken everything from her had never been the true danger at all. Vivian and her son had reached too far. They had spent what was not theirs to spend, and borrowed deep from people who do not forgive a debt. And now those people had come looking, hunting for the great fortune that had quietly vanished out of the empty shell of her father's company. They had traced it, somehow, down the long thread her father had hidden so well, to a quiet lane, to a ruined house, to a young woman they imagined could be frightened or pushed aside, or simply made to vanish into the dark. They were wrong about her, but they did not yet know that they were wrong. They came on a night with no moon. Nora had taken, by then, to sleeping with the lantern lit, and the great brass key tucked beneath her pillow, and one ear always kept half awake in the dark. So when the sound came at last, the low scrape of a window forced in its frame, the soft and careful groan of weight upon the old porch boards, she was awake and rising before she fully understood why. This was not the patient, gentle dragging of the great machine above. This was the sound of people who did not belong here, moving through her house in the dark. She rose without a light, her heart slamming hard against her ribs, her bare feet silent and cold upon the old boards. And she pressed herself back into the deep shadow at the foot of the grand staircase as the harsh beams of their flashlights swept and stabbed across the ruined foyer. There were 2 of them, perhaps a third, somewhere behind. Hard sorts, just as the old woman had said, moving with the rough and easy confidence of men long used to taking whatever they pleased. Men long used to no one ever standing in their way. They were searching, tearing the pale sheets from the shrouded furniture, pulling drawers from their cabinets and emptying them out onto the floor with a clatter, looking for the thing her father had hidden so well, the thing they had been sent through the dark to bring back. And Nora stood pressed into the shadow, her back against the cold curve of the banister, and she did the very hardest thing that a frightened person can ever be asked to do. She stayed perfectly still. She let them search the lower floor. She let them curse, low and ugly, at all the dust and the ruin. And she prayed, with everything that was left in her, that they would not think to go looking for a stair that, by every appearance, did not exist. But one of them was cleverer than the others. He had made his way up to the second floor and along the dim and shadowed hall. And Nora heard, with a dread that turned her cold all the way to the bone, the sound of him come to a stop at the dead end of the corridor, at the great mahogany wardrobe, still standing pushed aside from the wall, at the open black mouth of the hidden stair. "Up here," the man called down into the dark. "There's something up here. A door." And Nora moved. She did not stop to think. There was no time left in the world for thinking. She went up the narrow stair behind him, fast and silent, her father's voice loud and steady in her memory. "Walk toward the thing you fear." The man had reached the top. His flashlight swept wildly across the great machine, across the slow-turning gears and the swaying iron weight, and even a hard sort like him stopped a moment, struck dumb, caught flat by the sheer impossible strangeness of the thing. And that single moment was enough. Nora did not try to fight him. She was a slight woman, and he was near twice her size. And she had learned long ago, in rooms full of men who underestimated her, that raw strength is not at all the same thing as winning. Instead, she did the one thing he could not possibly have expected. She slipped past him into the dark, and she seized the small metal case from the desk, the case that held the proof of everything, the very thing they had been sent through the night to find. And she ran. He came after her with a furious shout, down the narrow, screaming stair, 2 treads at a time, his heavy hand grabbing out for her in the dark. It caught the back of her sleeve. It spun her hard against the wall of the upper hall, and the breath went out of her in a single gasp. The case flew loose from her grip, struck the floorboards, and skidded away into the blackness. She heard the others coming up now, heavy boots pounding on the stairs below, and for one long, terrible moment, pinned against the cold plaster with a stranger's hand twisting at her collar, Nora Hale believed, with her whole heart, that she had lost, that she had come so far, solved the riddle, found the proof, stood up straight at last, the way her father taught her, only to have all of it torn away from her again, here in the dark, the way it had been torn away once before, in a cold and paneled office, by people who smiled while they did it. And then, light. A great, sudden wash of headlights, swinging hard across the boarded windows from the lane below. And a voice, deep and furious and known to her, bellowing up from the open front door. Caleb. He had seen the lights, the strange and silent car. Something in his careful, watchful soul had not trusted it. And he had come. And the hard men, who were brave enough in the dark with a single frightened woman, found that they had no taste at all for being brave in the light, with a witness standing in the door. They let her go. They snatched up what little they could grab in their sudden panic, and they fled down the stairs and out into the night, their boots hammering across the porch, their car roaring away down the lane and into the dark from which it had come. Nora slid down the cold wall to the floor, shaking, her hand pressed flat to her aching collar, and Caleb was there, kneeling beside her in an instant, his face gone white with fear and fury both. "Are you hurt?" he said. "Nora, look at me. Are you hurt?" She shook her head. She could not yet find her voice to answer him. She crawled across the floor to where the small metal case had come to rest against the baseboard, and she lifted it with 2 trembling hands. And her heart broke clean in 2, for the case had struck the boards hard in the struggle. The catch had sprung wide, and the delicate thing inside it, the careful record of every wrong the 2 of them had done, the proof that was meant to make her whole and bring them low at last, had been crushed and torn and ruined in the fall. Damaged. The one true weapon her father had left her. Broken in the dark by the very people it had been made to destroy. They sat together on the front steps as the gray dawn came up, slow and pale, over Hawthorne Lane. Marlene came when she heard the news. She wrapped a warm blanket around the young woman's trembling shoulders, and she pressed a hot cup into her cold and aching hands, and she sat herself down beside her without a single word, the way that only the truly kind ever learn how to do. But Nora did not weep this time. She had gone somewhere past the place where weeping lives. She sat staring out at the lightning lane, the broken case lying useless in her lap, and she felt the old and familiar darkness rising up once more to claim her. The same darkness from the cold office, from the locked front door, from the thin motel mattress, in the smallest and loneliest hours of the night, the old feeling that the world had already decided what she was worth, and that no matter how hard she fought, no matter how far or how high she managed to climb, the world would find some way in the end to put her back down where it had decided she belonged. "Maybe they were right," she said at last. Her voice was very low, very tired. "Maybe I'm not made to carry a thing this large after all. Maybe I should take what's left of it and go, and let them have the rest. All of it. Before someone I care about gets hurt." Caleb said nothing. Marlene said nothing. They did not argue with her. They did not rush to tell her she was wrong, or fill up the quiet with bright and useless words of comfort. They simply sat with her, one on either side, in the gray and growing light of the new day, and that, in the end, was the thing that reached her. Not an argument, not a speech. The simple, stubborn fact of 2 people who had chosen to stay. When her own flesh and blood had thrown her out into the dark without a backward glance. These 2. A quiet craftsman she had known the span of a handful of days. An old woman from the bend in the lane with white hair and sharp, kind eyes. They had come running through the night for her. They had wrapped her in a blanket. They had sat themselves down beside her in the middle of her ruin, and they had not moved an inch. And something in that, something in being chosen, when she had been so completely thrown away, began very slowly to turn the darkness back. Nora looked down at the broken case in her lap, and she thought of her father's patient rhythm in the lamplight, A steady heart keeps its own time, he had told her once. The world can rush all it likes. The world had rushed at her. It had decided what she was worth in a cold office. And again, just now, in the dark of her own house. But a thing the world decides about a person is not the same as the truth of that person. Slowly, Nora Hale lifted her head, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. The weariness was still in it, deep and real. But underneath the weariness now, something had hardened quietly back into place. Something her father would have known again the instant he heard it. "No," she said. Caleb turned and looked at her. "No," she said again, and this time it came steadier, stronger. "They don't get to decide what I'm worth. They decided it in that office, and they were wrong. They decided it about this house, and they were wrong about that too." She closed her bruised hands slowly around the broken case in her lap. "And I'm not standing back up because I hate them. Hating them would only be one more thing they'd manage to take from me." She rose to her feet there in the dawn, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. "I'm standing up," she said, "because I will not let the people who threw me away be the ones who tell me what I am." She looked down at the broken case in her hand, the damaged proof, the weapon that was meant to set everything right. It was not the end. She understood that now, with a calm that took her by surprise. A careful man, a man who had dreamed up a riddle that would open only to a daughter's heart. A man who had foreseen the cruelty of the will and the auction and the long and lonely road that led to this very house. Such a man would never have left his only daughter with just one card to play. Somewhere in that great machine, somewhere in that warm and golden vault, her father had surely left her more. He had thought of everything else. He had thought every step of the way of her. And Nora Hale, bruised and tired and standing tall at last in the clean morning light, began at last to think of exactly how she was going to win. The morning after the men came in the dark, Nora Hale climbed the narrow stair one more time. She did not climb it as a frightened woman now. She climbed it slowly, steadily, one careful tread at a time. The way a person climbs toward a thing they have finally decided to face instead of flee. The great machine turned on above her, just as it had through every long and dark hour. The gears glimmered in the early light. The heavy weight scraped forward along its track and settled into its notch. The whole vast room beat on, patient as ever, as though nothing at all had happened in the night below. But something in Nora had changed. She came to a stop at the heart of it all, before the open mouth of the vault, the broken case still clutched in one hand, and she let her tired eyes travel slowly up, across the turning brass, across the humming cables, strung taut between the beams, across the great swaying arm of the pendulum, sweeping out its slow and certain path through the falling silver light. And she asked herself a single question. What would a careful man do? A man who had foreseen the cruelty of the will, the cold of the auction room, the long and lonely road that led, at the last, to this very house. A man who had built a door that opened to nothing in the world but a daughter's own heart, and hidden a whole fortune away in the patient belly of a clock. Would a man like that leave his only child with one single card to play? A man like that did not gamble. He planned. He built a thing. And then he built a second thing beneath it, quietly, in case the first should ever fail. That was the whole shape of him. That was the way he had loved her all along, not with soft and easy words, but with careful, patient, hidden provision laid down in the dark for her to find. She looked at the great machine with new eyes, and slowly, very slowly, she began to understand. The machine had never been only a lock. It was a clock, and a clock, above all else, keeps time. She went to the chalkboard once more, and she read its single line again. Slower this time. The door yields only to the rhythm of time. She had read it before, as a riddle to be solved. A single puzzle, with a single answer. Opened the one time, and then finished. And done. But her father had not been a man who built things that worked only once. He had built a thing that turned endlessly, on a great and patient cycle, scraping itself forward inch by inch along its sunken track, toward something, toward a completion, toward the slow end of one long revolution, and the quiet beginning of the next. And it came to her then, standing alone in the soft gray light, with a certainty that lifted the very breath from her chest. The vault had been the first gift, but the machine had gone on turning all this while for a reason. There was a second gift still waiting, deeper, hidden behind the turning of the whole great wheel, a thing that no thief in the world could ever steal in a single night, because it would open itself to no one who did not first know to set the rhythm, and then to wait through the long and patient hours, while the great wheel came slowly around to its close. Her father had built her a fail-safe that lived inside of time itself, and time, unlike a small metal case, could not be crushed upon a floor in the dark. It could not be torn, or stolen, or carried off into the night. It could only be waited for. So Nora set the rhythm once more. She stilled the swaying iron bucket with the flat of her hand, and she closed her eyes, and she found her father's patient beat again in the quiet rooms of her memory. 2 taps, and a pause. 2 taps, and a pause. She set the weights by feeling, the way she had before, lifting and adding and lifting again, until the great arm swung slow and even and true, until it kept perfect time with the steady heart she carried in her own chest. Tick, and a pause. Tock, and a pause. Then Nora sat herself down on the stool at the very heart of the great machine, and she waited. She waited as the morning light moved across the high skylight overhead, and the day climbed and brightened and slowly began to turn. She waited as Caleb came up the narrow stair and sat himself down beside her, the two of them saying little, watching the great wheel come patiently around. And all the while, a colder thought turned with it. The hard men had fled into the dark, but men like that did not stay frightened for long. They knew the house now. They knew the stair, and the great wheel would not be hurried, not for fear, not for anything. It would close when it closed, and not one moment before. So Nora kept one ear bent toward the lane below, and one eye fixed upon the slow turning of the wheel, and she prayed that the first would stay silent until the second was done. She waited as Marlene climbed that narrow stair for the first time in all her long years, one careful step after another, and stood at the top with her hand pressed to her mouth, gazing up at the impossible golden cathedral of brass that the strange clockmaker had hidden there. "Lord above," the old woman whispered, all this time, behind a wall. And Nora waited as the light began, at long last, to soften and to fail. The great weight scraped forward, settled, scraped forward once more, the cycle drawing, hour by patient hour, toward its quiet close. And then, as the last of the day's amber light went soft and golden across the brass, the great machine reached the very end of its long turning, and there came a sound that none of them had heard before, a deep and resonant chime rising up out of the very center of the great cylinder. Not the scrape of the moving weight, not the low hum of the straining cables. A clear, ringing note, pure as a great bell, struck once in a quiet and empty church. It swelled, and it held, and it filled the whole vast room with a sound that seemed to move through the bones of them as much as through the cooling air. And on the heavy side of the great pendulum's swinging bob, a small panel, seamless and invisible until that very moment, slid quietly open. Nora rose slowly to her feet, and she crossed to it, and she reached her hand inside, and she drew out a flat packet wrapped in oilcloth, kept safe and dry and untouched at the patient turning heart of the great machine. Inside the oilcloth, there lay two things. The first was a copy, a second, careful record of every wrong the two of them had done. The very same proof that had been crushed and torn and ruined on the floorboards in the dark, made whole again here, made twice, hidden away, deep in the turning of the clock, where no thief in the world would ever think to stop and wait for it. Her father had made two of everything. Of course he had. She should have known it from the start. A man who built two doors. A man who left two weapons. A man who had looked at the carelessness and the cruelty of the people around him and quietly planned for the worst that they could do. And the second thing, inside the oilcloth, was a single page, folded once, in his own familiar hand. Nora's eyes were wet before she had read a single word of it. If you have found this, the letter began, then the worst has come to pass. The first was lost to you. And if the first was lost, then they came for you, in the night, the way I feared they might. And for that, my child, I am sorrier than these few words could ever hold. But hear me now. I did not build one door. I built two. I did not leave you with one weapon. I left you a second, hidden where their grasping hands could never reach it, because I knew them. I had spent years learning the shape of their hearts, and I knew that a careful man must always plan for the cruelty of careless people. You are holding now the thing that makes you whole again. Take it to the right hands, to the ones whose proper business it is to weigh such matters. You will not have to fight them in the street, child. You will not have to raise your voice or trade their cruelty back to them. The truth, once it is set in the right hands, does its own slow and certain work. And when it is finished, do not let it harden you. That is the last thing I will ever ask of you. They were small and frightened and greedy people, and they will answer in time for the things they did. But you are not them. You were never once like them, not for a single day of your life. Live well, live gently, live in the light where I always hope to see you. That is the whole of what I built all of this for. It was always, only, for you. Dad. Nora held the letter to her chest, there in the last of the golden light, and she let the tears come freely down her face. But they were not the tears of the cold office. They were not the tears of the locked front door, or the thin motel mattress in the smallest hours of the night. They were the tears of a daughter who had been reached, at long last, across every distance that the world can put between two people, by a father who had thought of everything, who had hidden one final gift inside the very turning of time itself, so that even death could not stop him from reaching out a hand to protect his child. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and then she did exactly as he had asked of her. The truth, once it was set in the right hands, did its own quiet and certain work. There was no shouting, no spectacle, no grand and public unmasking. Nora did not storm any garden party in a sharp new suit. She did not throw any cruel words back across any cold glass desk. She did not need to. She simply gave the proof to those whose business it was to weigh such things. And then she stepped back, and she let the slow and patient weight of the truth do the work it had been made, all along, to do. And far away, in the grand house where Nora herself had grown up, the careful illusion that the woman named Vivian had spent so long building began, very quietly, to come apart at every seam. First came the questions, then the accounts, frozen and pulled open at last to the cold light of day, then the slow and dreadful dawning in a woman who had believed herself the winner of it all, that the empire she had schemed and lied and smiled so long to seize had been an empty shell from the very beginning, a hollow and worthless thing, a husk that her husband had pressed into her eager hands with a quiet and knowing smile, understanding to the last exactly what she would do with it, and exactly what it would cost her. She had inherited the debts and not 1 single cent of the worth, and the bad sort of people that she and her son had borrowed so deeply from had little patience and less mercy for a debtor who turned out to have empty hands. It was on a gray and quiet afternoon, some while later, that the car came slowly up Hawthorne Lane. Nora saw it from the porch where she had been working alongside Caleb to set the sagging rail to rights. She set down her tools, and she straightened, and she watched it come. It was a fine car, but it had a certain look about it now. The look of a fine thing that has been kept a little too long past its time. And when it rolled to a stop at the foot of the drive, and the door opened, the woman who stepped out of it was not at all the woman from the cold and paneled office. This woman was thinner, paler, the hard, bright polish of her worn down now to something brittle and uncertain underneath. Vivian. She came up the gravel drive slowly, her heels turning on the loose stones, and she stopped at the very bottom of the porch steps. And for a long moment, the two women only looked at one another, across all the long distance of everything that had passed between them. The daughter who had been put out the door with 2 suitcases at her feet, and the stepmother who had stood inside and locked it behind her. "So," Vivian said at last. Her voice had lost its cream entirely. It came out thin now, and tired, and edged with something very close to fear. "It was here, the whole of it. He hid it all here." She gave a small and broken laugh and lifted her eyes to the great gray house rising up above her. In this ruin, at the end of nowhere." "Yes," Nora said, simply. She did not come down the steps to meet her. She stood at the top of them, framed in the doorway of her own house, and she let the woman stand below, in the gravel, looking up, The reversal of it was lost on neither of them. "They are going to take everything," Vivian said. And now the fear in her was plain and naked and impossible to hide. "Preston, myself, there is nothing left to give them. Nothing at all." She lifted her chin and reached, one last desperate time, for the old command that had once lived in her voice. "You could help. You have all of it now. A single word from you. A sum, even, a small one. Surely, after all of these years, surely there is something still owed between us." "There was something owed," Nora said quietly, and Vivian fell silent. "There was a debt between us," Nora went on, and her voice was steady and level, and it held no cruelty in it at all, only the plain and simple truth. "A daughter is owed a home. A daughter is owed the small and ordinary decency of not being thrown out into the cold street with 2 suitcases and a check that was meant as an insult." She paused. "You decided what that debt was worth, Vivian. You decided it in that office, with your dry eyes and your folded handkerchief. You named the number yourself. You called it $15,000. She let the words settle in the cool and quiet air between them. "So that," Nora said, "is what I owe you in return. That and not 1 penny more." Vivian stood at the bottom of the steps for a long moment, and then something in her seemed, at last, to give way entirely. The brittle polish cracked clean through to whatever small and frightened thing had been hiding beneath it all this while. She did not shout. She did not threaten. There was no power left anywhere in her to do either of those things now. She simply looked, for one bare moment, like exactly what she had always been underneath. A person who had reached out and grasped at everything within sight, and had closed her hand, in the end, on nothing at all. "He outplayed me," she said, almost to herself now, wonderingly. "The entire time, sitting right there across from me, letting me believe that I had won." She shook her head slowly, side to side. "He was a fool for that girl. He always was." "No," Nora said, and for the first time, there was something almost gentle in her voice. Not gentleness for Vivian's sake. She had earned none. It was gentleness for her father's. "He wasn't a fool," Nora said quietly. "He simply knew the difference between what only looks valuable to the eye and what truly is." Vivian had no answer at all to give to that. She turned after a moment, and she walked back down the long drive, her heels turning and slipping on the loose gray stones. And she got into the fine and tired old car, and she drove away down Hawthorne Lane, and out of the lane, and out of Nora Hale's life altogether, to go and face the slow consequences of all the things she had grasped at, and lied for, and could not, in the end, hold on to. What became of her after that, and of her son, and of the bad sort of people they had borrowed so deeply from, was a matter that worked itself out somewhere far away from that quiet lane. Nora did not follow it closely. She had been set free of them, and that, she found, was enough for her. She had no wish to stand at a distance and watch them fall. No hunger at all to feed upon their ruin, the way that they had once fed so eagerly upon hers. Her father had asked one last thing of her: "Do not let it harden you." And she found, looking inward, that it had not. She stood on the porch a long while after the car had gone, watching the empty lane. Caleb came and stood beside her, and he said nothing. in the easy and comfortable way that had grown up quietly between the two of them over the long working weeks. And down the lane, Marlene came out onto her own front porch and lifted one small hand into the gray air. And Nora lifted hers back, and something in Nora Hale settled, finally, into its proper place. For weeks now, she had been a woman running from a cold and paneled office, from a front door locked behind her, from hard men moving through her house in the dark. She had been a woman with nothing left to her name, and nowhere on this wide earth to set it down. And now she stood on the steps of a house that belonged to her, in a town that was, slowly and surely, beginning to belong to her too. With a quiet and steady man at her side, a man who had come running through the dark of night when she needed him, and an old woman down at the bend in the lane who waved to her each and every morning across the small gap between their two porches. She had set out once only to find a roof that no one could ever take away from her again, and somewhere along the way, she had found a thing so very much larger than a roof. She had found a place where she was wanted. She had found, against all the odds, somewhere to belong. In the long months that followed, the great house at the end of Hawthorne Lane began, slowly, to change. Nora did not make it grand. She had had grand once in another life entirely. She had had the manicured gardens and the warm and golden windows and the family that locked the door at her back without a single backward glance. She had learned in the very hardest way that a person can ever learn it exactly what grand is truly worth. When the hearts of the people living inside of it are cold and grasping and small. So she did not restore the great house to be admired or photographed or envied. She restored it to be lived in. She and Caleb worked through the turning of the seasons. They mended the sagging porch where the two of them had once stood together in the gray dawn. They cleared the thorned ivy away from the old brick chimney, and they let the warm light back into the dark and shrouded rooms that had stood closed for so long. They coaxed the tired old house, board by patient board, nail by careful nail, back toward the warmth that it had surely held in some far better age, and the great machine up in the attic they left turning. But they did one new thing with it. For Nora had come to understand a sorrowful truth about that hidden cathedral of brass and steel and golden light. Silas Crane, the kind and lonely man whom the whole town had once kept their distance from, had built a thing of true and lasting wonder. And then he had hidden it away, sealed it behind a wall, where no one could ever be frightened by it, or fail to understand it, or stand in the lane and call it strange. He had spent the whole of his life keeping other people's secrets safe. And in the doing of it, he had let himself be made into a secret, too. Nora thought that was a deeply sorrowful thing, and she decided quietly in her own heart to undo it. So she opened the roof to the light. She had a great clock face set into the high gable of the house, in the place where the hidden skylight had been for so many silent years. And she had it connected, by Caleb's careful and patient hands, to the slow turning of the great machine below, so that the long and faithful cycle that her father had hidden away there in the dark could be seen, at last, by every soul in the town. And on a clear and quiet evening, with the whole of the little town gathered down in the lane below, drawn out of their homes by the rumor of what the strange young woman at the end of Hawthorne Lane had gone and done, The great clock began, for the very first time, to keep its time where all of them could see it. The long hand swept slow and certain across the wide pale face, and on the hour, that deep and resonant chime rose up out of the very heart of the old house, the bell-clear note that Nora had first heard alone, in the amber light, on the day her father reached across death to touch her one last time. It rolled out now over the rooftops of the quiet town, out over the porches and the trimmed hedges, and all the upturned faces gathered there, turned skyward toward the gable in open and silent wonder. A house the whole town had once turned its back upon, now keeping the time for every living soul in it. The children who had once dared one another to touch the front gate and run shrieking back into the safe golden light of their own porches, now lingered at the foot of the drive each evening just to hear the great bell ring out the hour. The old men who had lowered their voices passing the gate now walked up the lane on purpose of an evening to stand and listen. And the house that had sat for a whole generation like a rotten tooth at the dead end of the lane became slowly and surely the warm and beating heart of the very town that had so long forgotten it was there. Marlene stood at Nora's side on the porch that first golden evening, listening to the great bell roll its note out over the rooftops. He would have loved this, the old woman said softly. Silas, the strange, kind man that they all threw away. She wiped at the corner of her eye. All those years, he kept the whole world's secret safe, and they paid him back with nothing but fear and a wide berth on the sidewalk. She reached over and squeezed Nora's hand in her small, dry one. And now, look, now the whole town comes out at dusk just to listen to his work sing. You gave him that, my dear. You finally let them see what he was. And Nora, watching the lane below fill up with upturned, wondering faces in the soft golden light of the evening, felt the whole truth of it settle deep and warm into her chest. The world is so very quick to look at a thing and to decide that it is worthless. A house, ruined and abandoned and choked with ivy, hiding a golden heart that no one ever once troubled themselves to go and find. A quiet man, strange and solitary and odd in his hours, hiding a deep and gentle kindness that the town never paused long enough to see. A daughter, rid out of a will in a cold and paneled room, and told in plain and simple numbers that she did not, and never truly had, belonged. How quick the world is to write a thing off as nothing. And how often, how very, very often, it turns out to be wrong. Nora Hale had been thrown away by the people who, of anyone in the world, should have held her the closest. She had been told, in cold numbers on a page, that she was worth almost nothing at all. And she had walked out into the dark of night, with 2 suitcases in her hands and a heart full of ruin, certain in her bones that she had lost the only place in the whole world where she had ever belonged. But she had not, in truth, lost it. She had only not yet found it. For the place where a person truly belongs is not always the house that they were born inside of. Sometimes it is a ruined old house at the dead end of a forgotten lane. A quiet craftsman who comes running through the dark when he is needed. An old woman who lifts her hand each morning across the small gap between 2 porches. A whole small town, gathered together in the golden evening light, with all their faces turned upward toward a great bell ringing out the hour. Sometimes the family that throws you away was never really your family at all, and the family that you find standing together in the wreckage of everything you lost, is the one that was always, quietly, meant for you from the very start. On a quiet evening, when the town had gone home to their suppers, and the lane had emptied out, and the light had gone soft and blue, Nora Hale climbed the narrow stair one final time. Alone. She came to stand at the heart of the great machine, in the last of the falling light, and she listened to it turn, scrape, and settle, scrape, and settle. The patient rhythm her father had hidden away there, in the dark, all those years ago. The beat of two fingers upon an old kitchen table going on and on and on through every long and worried and sleepless night of his life. A steady heart, he had told her once, with that small and private smile of his, keeps its own steady time. The world can rush all it likes. She rested her hand against the cool and gleaming brass. "I kept it, Dad," she said softly, "to the turning gears, to the swaying weight, to the great bell waiting, silent now, up in the dark of the gable. I kept my own time, all the way through, just like you taught me." And the old machine beat on, steady and golden and warm, all around her in the deepening dusk, keeping time now for a whole town that had once turned its face away, keeping the patient rhythm of a father's hidden, careful love, and the rhythm of a daughter who had refused, in the very end, to let a cruel and careless world be the one to tell her what she was worth.